Russian military jets entered the NATO country's airspace without permission.
Tensions between NATO and Russia reached their peak in September 2025, following the Cold War era.
It's clear that Putin has started on a new level, testing NATO and a new level provocation. So
there is now discussion in the heart of Europe about directly shooting down Russian aircraft violating NATO borders and completely closing Russian borders. And this did not happen suddenly. Russian drones were shot down by F-35s and F-16s in Polish airspace last week. NATO fighter jets scrambled near the Romanian border. And now, the spark has reached its peak in Tallinn. The Estonian Air Force reported that on September 19th, 3 Russian MiG-31s violated its airspace for 12 minutes. This was too obvious to be not mistake of a drunk pilot, too daring to be a navigation error. This was an extremely dangerous gamble by Vladimir Putin to test NATO's red lines, gauge the alliance's resolve, and bring the West to the brink of all-out war. However, this gamble would simply be Putin's second major critical mistake in a week. Now, Putin's latest move was not just an alarm calling NATO to the field. The issue here was what Tallinn was planning for Russia. And what followed was much more frightening for Putin. Because the Estonian government wasted no time in invoking Article 4, a mechanism rarely used in NATO history. Tallinn has 2 direct levers against Putin's strategic mistake. First, Estonia has the authority to fire on and, if necessary, shoot down platforms violating its national airspace, acting alone and within its own engagement rules. Last week, the Polish Air Force shot down Russian aircraft that violated its border. This move showed that Estonia could act in a similar manner. Second, the option of legally closing the land border and shifting the political and economic cost to Moscow is looking increasingly rational. Estonia has already closed the Narva bridge on the Russian border. Now, the complete closure of the 294-kilometer Russian border is on the table. Crossings such as Narva, Ivangorod and Koidula could be completely closed under the pretext of security. Estonia's border with Russia is not an artery on the scale of the Poland-Belarus border. However, the controlled narrowing of the northern line would be a secondary earthquake for Putin. This might not directly strike the Kaliningrad corridor, but because the Poland-Belarus line is closed, it would be much more costly for Moscow than it would normally be. At the same time, Estonia is building a 40-kilometer anti-tank trench along the Russian border. The total length of the planned defense belt on the eastern border will be approximately 100 kilometers from the land border, with a depth of approximately 40 kilometers. This would be a grave for Russian tanks and a serious deterrent in the event of a potential conflict. So, can the Kremlin exert pressure against these measures? In fact, it will not dare to do so, because Russia is like a paper tiger, exhausted. Russia was unable to prevent Poland from closing its border, the downing of Russian aircraft, or even the Ukrainian attacks on the Primorsk port in St. Petersburg. Likewise, we see that Estonia or Poland may not necessarily need NATO deterrence to grapple with Russia. That is why a show of force with 3 MiG-31s raised the question for Estonia of whether to trust the alliance or demonstrate its own will. When discussing Estonia's option of engaging alone, it is inevitable to recall Turkey's downing of a Russian Su-24 on the Syrian border in 2015. Let's refresh our NATO memory on what Article 4 means. In the midst of this political fire, perhaps the most striking and harshest reaction came from the small Baltic country of Lithuania. Lithuanian Defense Minister Dovita Šakalina, in a post on her social media account, reminded the world, and especially the Kremlin, of a historic event. Turkey set an example 10 years ago. This is something to think about. This short sentence actually contained an extremely heavy and layered message. The minister was referring to Turkey's downing of a Russian Su-24 fighter jet in November 2015, despite repeated warnings to leave its airspace. That incident marked the first time a NATO member had shot down a Russian warplane since the Cold War, leading to a deep crisis between the two countries that lasted for months. The Lithuanian minister's reminder was actually a veiled message to the Kremlin. Don't push our patience any further, because within this alliance, there are those who will not hesitate to pull the trigger when red lines are crossed. This was the hawkish wing within NATO, raising its voice against Putin's narrative of the West being weak and indecisive, and it took the tension in the Baltics to an even more dangerous level. Turkey's 2015 case holds 2 lessons for today. First, A border violation is an independent incident. A national ROE can be applied after a sufficient warning approach escort cycle, which is what Ankara did in the Su-24 incident. Second, on such critical nights, Article 4 consultations are the seatbelt that links a single country's decision to collective protection. That day, the NATO table was opened, relations with Russia hardened, but alliance discipline was not compromised. Today, the same discipline is seen in the Estonia and Poland files, swift but measured. Now let's look at the similarity with the incident in Estonian airspace. On the morning of Friday, September 19, 2025, the NATO Quick Reaction Alert Chain was immediately activated. Italian F-35s stationed in Amari scrambled, and carriers from Sweden and Finland were added to the picture. Opposite them was not a lost civilian aircraft, but 3 MiG-31 interceptor aircraft belonging to the Russian Air Force, fully equipped with R-73 air-to-air missiles. They were flying with their transponders off and had not filed a flight plan. The Russian MiG-31 jets were flying illegally for a full 12 minutes deep within Estonia's sovereign airspace, near Vaindloo Island in the Gulf of Finland. They were intercepted by Swedish Gripen and Italian F-35 jets and were forced to turn back. Hours later, Polish border guards reported that 2 Russian warplanes had made a low-level pass over a Baltic Sea oil platform belonging to the Polish oil company Baltic. A brief reminder is critical here. Just a week earlier, Polish airspace was tested by multiple window violations by Russian-made drones. NATO fighter jets shot down some of these targets in Polish airspace. Warsaw invoked Article 4 consultations. The morning after that night, the alliance announced its reinforcement package, dubbed Eastern Sentry. Rafales from France, 4 Eurofighters from Germany, 2 F-16s, and an air defense frigate from Denmark were added to the eastern flank. Now, this framework has been compounded by the Estonia case. This move caused a seismic effect at NATO headquarters in Brussels and in all European capitals. Article 4 is an extremely serious step, calling all allies to the table when the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of a member is threatened. This does not mean, let's just talk. It means, if one of us is under threat, we are all under threat, and we will decide together what to do now. NATO spokespeople announced that the North Atlantic Council would meet on October 1st to discuss the incident in detail. So why is Article 4 so important? Because in the alliance's legal memory, Article 4 is the constitution of what to do when there is no war yet. NATO's own official text also describes Article 4 as a fundamental consultation mechanism. When one of the parties believes that its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is under threat, the North Atlantic Council convenes immediately. Intelligence sharing is deepened, and the steps to be taken are determined together. The rare use of Article 4 amplifies the impact of each invocation. When the Council convenes, it is not merely a statement that is issued. The list of operational measures is updated. In current practice, this list includes the air policing rhythm, patrol windows, ROE updates, a communication strategy against information operations, and preparations for an additional sanctions package. Here, Washington's tone is a separate barometer. The language used by the White House remains calm but cautiously firm in most crisis headlines. This time, US President Donald Trump's announcement of the issue from the Oval Office, emphasizing that it could be a big problem, contains 2 messages. First, the issue is seen not as a distant Baltic event in US domestic politics, but as a file that tests the security of the alliance. Second, the promise that NATO's collective reflex will be supported by US public diplomacy. In this context, Washington's emphasis on the consultation process is critical not only in terms of deterrence, but also in terms of reducing the risk of miscalculation. The following distinction must be made clear from the outset. Article 4 is not Article 5. Article 5 is the practical framework for the principle that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Article 4 is the clause that states, when we see a threat, we sit down together and decide. But Article 4 is not a procedure to be taken lightly. On the contrary, it is the gateway to the crisis management chain. The fact that there have been few invocations in the history of the alliance increases the political weight of each call. NATO's emergency meeting in the same week that Turkey shot down a Russian Su-24 aircraft in 2015 is still fresh in our memories. That case is an example of how Article 4 consultations can have a multiplier effect in terms of rules of engagement and language of deterrence. Article 4 was also on the table during the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Now, the cases of Poland and Estonia show that the same article has been transformed into an early warning platform in Eastern Europe once again. Estonia's strong protest, Lithuania's 2015 Su-24 reminder, Poland's platform warning, and the Scandinavians' silent but swift takeoff. The sum of these is a message. There is patience, but there is also a plan for impatience. Translate this sentence to the Russian public, and you get the meaning. The next miscalculation will come home to roost. And home is not just the Kremlin's office, it is the community's budget, the industry's supply chain, the regional trade networks. Now, another move that may be putting Moscow in the most difficult position came from the EU. So what does this scenario trigger on the US and NATO front? First, the logic of permanent duty becoming the norm on both sides of the Atlantic. Eastern Sentry is not a crisis mission. It is already on the calendar, added to the planning software, and logistically tied down. This means longer stays at sea, more frequent tanker and AWACS windows, and more intense F-35/F-16/Eurofighter rotations. Second, the mention of critical infrastructure protection in the same sentence as air patrols. This implies common protocols and new assignments for energy platforms, cable lines, port facilities, and coastal radars. Third, the increased weight of the Nordic countries in information sharing. Sweden and Finland feed data into the picture not only with aircraft, but also with radar architecture and maritime surveillance networks. Fourth, the periodicity of Washington's heavy presence messages. Rotations of B-52s or other heavy bomber platforms in Europe are not solely intended as an attack. They are a means of communication and deterrence. Showing ammunition loaded in the distance can prevent a minor incident nearby. Such rotations add a note of unexpected guest to the lines of Russia's air-sea calendar. Fifth, the thickening of the air defense umbrella over Germany and the Scandinavian countries. The forward deployment of systems like Patriot/SAMPT, presented as flight safety along the Polish and Baltic fronts, actually serves to dampen the appetite for flight. Each new battery adds a small amount of time and a large amount of risk to the Kremlin's plans. This is not direct confrontation, it is a strategy of disrupting the risk-return curve. Berlin's role in this scenario is to keep the logistical backbone alive. Train corridors, supply nodes, maintenance and repair lines. The continued flow to the Baltic and Polish lines is the fuel for deterrence. Germany does this not by talking, but by deploying and operating. The UK and Scandinavia, meanwhile, leave no gaps in airspace and maritime patrols. France's increased visibility over the Baltic strengthens South-North coordination. Italy's deployment of F-35s in Estonia demonstrates the speed of the Mediterranean-Baltic bridge. Deterrence is a product of timing, not geography. The question, what about Article 5, must be deliberately kept on the table. Because the alliance's goal is not to escalate, but to make escalation costly, Article 4 has been invoked twice and produced political and operational results. Article 5 comes into play when an event falls within the definition of an armed attack. Who would want that threshold? NATO does not, because it invests in peace, not war. Russia does not want it, because the story in which it says, "I will win," also says, it has a lot to lose. But this does not mean that threshold management is easy. Miscalculations and chain reactions pose risks. That is why protocols, frequencies, approach departure geometries, and visual contact procedures are written down to the millisecond. So Article 5 is not on the table. It is in place, keeping the table balanced. And yes, the rest of the story is as intriguing as it is risky. Will the next violation come at a lower altitude? Will there be more of them? Or will another grey area emerge instead? It is unknown. But this much is known. The alliance's reflexes have quickened. Its stance has become clearer, and its decision cycle has shortened. This trio makes Putin's test policy costly. For the Russian people, the result translates into a line on the screen, a price at the market, and a weight at the factory. For Ukraine, the result is a tailwind of political momentum and open channels of technical support. For NATO, the result is maintaining Article 4 as a function rather than a cry. This event is not a sign of a major war, it is a sign of a major mistake. The Kremlin triggered a major nervous system with a small risk. That nervous system has been activated not just for today, but for tomorrow and the day after. That is why a 12-minute violation has taken its place at the top of the geopolitical agenda for the next 12 months. From now on, the calendar will be much more challenging for Putin. Thank you for choosing us.